In the spring of 781, a scholar from northern England stood before Charlemagne in the Italian city of Parma, weighing an invitation that would determine whether centuries of Roman learning survived into the medieval future. Alcuin of York, c. 735 to 804, already past 40 and master of the most distinguished cathedral school in the British Isles, faced a choice between comfortable eminence at home and the precarious work of reshaping an empire's intellectual foundations. His decision would affect not merely his own career but the preservation of classical texts, the training of clergy across Western Europe, and the very possibility that post-Roman civilization might recover knowledge rather than endure its permanent loss. Alcuin was born around 735 in Northumbria, the kingdom occupying what is now northern England and southern Scotland. His precise family origins remain uncertain, though he was neither noble nor obscure. He likely entered the Cathedral School at York as a child around 750, during a period when Northumbrian monasteries and schools had become the intellectual powerhouses of the Christian West. York itself stood as a remarkable anomaly in the fragmented landscape of post-Roman Britain. Archbishop Ecbert, who led the York Church from 732 until 766, had assembled an extraordinary cathedral library stocked with manuscripts from Rome, southern France, and Ireland. These texts included works by Jerome, Augustine, Ambrose, and Cassiodorus, alongside classical authors such as Virgil, Horace, Cicero, and Pliny. Northumbria in the mid-8th century enjoyed a window of relative stability. The kingdom was neither dominated by stronger Anglo-Saxon powers nor yet devastated by Viking raids, which would intensify after 793. This breathing space allowed the cathedral schools and monasteries to flourish. The tradition of learning had deep roots. Bede of Jarrow, who died in 735, the year Alcuin was born, had established Northumbria as a centre of historical scholarship and biblical exegesis. His ecclesiastical history and chronological writings set standards for intellectual rigour that still resonated through monastic and cathedral communities. Alcuin inherited this legacy but also confronted its fragility. Royal patronage in Northumbria was unreliable. Political factions competed for influence. The technology of manuscript production was slow and vulnerable to loss. Knowledge, once written and shelved, could vanish through fire, flood, or the simple decay of parchment. Alcuin's formation was shaped decisively by three figures spanning generations. Archbishop Ecbert, though Alcuin never studied directly under him, established the institutional foundation through his library acquisitions and patronage. When Ecbert died in 766, his kinsman Aelbert became archbishop and took direct charge of Alcuin's education. Aelbert appointed Alcuin master of the Cathedral School around 778, when Alcuin was in his early 40s, entrusting him with curriculum design, teaching, and library expansion. A third influence, though mediated through texts rather than personal contact, was Bede himself. Alcuin absorbed Bede's methods of historical chronology, biblical commentary, and the integration of classical learning with Christian doctrine. Under Aelbert's mentorship, Alcuin composed his first significant works, textbooks on grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic presented in question-and-answer format, designed for oral recitation and memorization by students. He wrote poetry in Latin hexameters, celebrating the library at York and the intellectual chain connecting Northumbrian scholars back to Augustine and Jerome. These early works demonstrated both his command of classical forms and his belief that education was inseparable from spiritual formation. Alcuin's reputation grew. Around 778 or 779, Aelbert sent Alcuin to Rome to request the pallium, the embroidered vestment symbolizing archiepiscopal authority, from Pope Hadrian I. On the return journey in the spring of 781, travelling through Parma, Alcuin encountered Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and already embarked on a campaign of military conquest and cultural ambition. Charlemagne, impressed by Alcuin's fluency in Latin, his knowledge of the liberal arts, and his accounts of the York Cathedral Library, invited him to lead the palace school at the Frankish royal court in Aachen, in what is now Germany. Part 2 examines how Alcuin's breakthrough innovations transformed Carolingian education and manuscript culture into engines of textual preservation and intellectual revival. Part 2 of 3. Having accepted Charlemagne's invitation by late 782, Alcuin now redirected his life's accumulated expertise from training clergy in a provincial English cathedral to reforming education across the vast Frankish dominions spanning from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. This shift required adapting York's monastic methods to Frankish needs and aligning his intellectual mission with the political ambitions of a ruler intent on rivaling the Byzantine emperors in both military reach and cultural prestige. Alcuin's breakthroughs rested on three interconnected strategic decisions. First, he reorganized the Palatine School at Aachen, transforming it from a court facility for royal children into a model institution whose methods could be exported to monasteries and cathedral schools throughout the empire. He introduced a rigorous graded curriculum based on the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic as the trivium, followed by arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy as the quadrivium. Crucially, Alcuin insisted that pagan classical authors like Virgil and Horace were.
You've been binge-watching all morning. The dishes are calling. But here's the thing. Taking care of yourself isn't a break from living. It's part of it. Take a pause. Wash. Breathe. Because you deserve it.
Indispensable for mastering Latin style and argumentation. This decision sparked fierce resistance among Frankish clergy who viewed pagan literature as morally corrupting and dangerous. Alcuin countered that ignorance of classical rhetoric left priests unable to refute heresy or preach effectively. Charlemagne's unwavering support shielded him from censure. Second, Alcuin became the principal author of the Admonitio Generalis, a comprehensive reform capitulary issued in 789 that fundamentally reshaped educational governance across the empire. This document mandated the establishment of schools in every cathedral and major monastery, required clergy to achieve basic literacy in Latin, and standardized liturgical texts to eliminate dangerous regional variations in Christian practice. The Admonitio transformed education from a monastic luxury into an empire-wide obligation backed by royal law and imperial inspection. Third, Alcuin championed the development of Caroline minuscule, a new standardized script that replaced the bewildering mixture of half-uncial, cursive, and regional hands with clear, uniform letterforms optimized for speed and accuracy. This innovation dramatically improved copying productivity and reduced transmission errors. Why did this work? Alcuin achieved alignment between intellectual mission and institutional power. Charlemagne provided resources, legal mandates, personal participation in debates, and protection from critics. Alcuin supplied pedagogical expertise, knowledge of proven methods from York, and theological authority. Together, they created a mutually reinforcing system where educational reform enhanced imperial legitimacy while imperial resources enabled educational expansion. Between 782 and 796, Alcuin's output reached its peak through several pivotal moments that reveal the scope of his influence. In 789, he presided over a theological council at Frankfurt that addressed the adoptionist heresy spreading from Spain, a doctrine claiming Christ was an adopted son of God rather than eternally begotten. Alcuin composed dense doctrinal refutations synthesizing Augustine and contemporary arguments, establishing himself as the empire's foremost theological authority. In 793, news reached Aachen that Vikings had sacked the monastery at Lindisfarne on the Northumbrian coast, killing monks and plundering the shrine of St. Cuthbert. For Alcuin, this was catastrophic on multiple levels. Lindisfarne housed irreplaceable manuscripts, and the attack vindicated his belief that learning must be secured through institutional expansion and imperial protection. He responded with urgent letters to Northumbria.
The sink is full. Your mind is fuller. But something shifts when you start washing. Warm water. Soap. Purpose. Each plate you clean is a thought you release. It's not just dishes. It's freedom.
Nobles and clergy, interpreting the raid as divine punishment for moral laxity and urging spiritual reform. These letters, copied and circulated widely, reveal Alcuin's pastoral urgency and his conviction that learning and piety were inseparable obligations. Around 794, Alcuin established a scriptorium at the monastery of St. Martin of Tours in the Loire Valley. He recruited and trained monks in Caroline minuscule script and supervised the production of hundreds of manuscripts, complete Bibles, patristic commentaries, classical texts, and liturgical books. By one conservative estimate, More than half of all surviving classical Latin texts owe their preservation directly to manuscripts copied in Tours Scriptoria during or shortly after Alcuin's tenure. In 796, Charlemagne appointed Alcuin abbot of St. Martin of Tours, granting him financial independence, full administrative authority, and a permanent base for his scriptorial work. This was simultaneously a promotion and a subtle exile from court politics, where younger rivals had begun to challenge his influence. Alcuin's educational and textual reforms inevitably provoked opposition from multiple quarters. Some Frankish bishops resented the imposition of Northumbrian standards and the emphasis on classical rhetoric over purely biblical study. Theodulf of Orleans, a Spanish Visigoth and rival intellectual at court, argued fiercely that excessive focus on grammar and literary style distracted clergy from scriptural exegesis and pastoral care. Local monastic communities sometimes resisted the Caroline minuscule script, viewing their own regional hands as adequate and resenting external mandates. Alcuin countered that mastery of correct Latin was the prerequisite for understanding scripture accurately and that standardization prevented theological confusion arising from scribal errors. The tension between liberal arts education and biblically focused piety persisted throughout the medieval period, never fully resolved. In the short term, Alcuin's reforms succeeded remarkably. Literacy rates among Frankish clergy rose perceptibly. Manuscript production increased exponentially. A generation of scholars trained by Alcuin and his students staffed cathedral schools and monasteries from Italy to the Rhine. The Palatine School became the training ground for future bishops, abbots, and imperial administrators. Yet the long-term survival of Alcuin's achievements remained precarious. The Carolingian Empire fragmented severely after Charlemagne's death in 814, and especially after his grandson Louis the Pious died in 840. Civil wars between Louis's sons devastated the empire politically and materially. Viking raids intensified throughout the 9th century, systematically destroying monasteries and scriptoria. Educational standards declined sharply between 850 and 950. Many schools closed. Yet the manuscripts Alcuin's scribes produced survived these catastrophes. Tours, though attacked, preserved its scriptorium and collections. The Caroline minuscule script became the standard across medieval Europe for centuries. The textual tradition of classical Latin authors survived primarily through copies made in the Alcuin era and immediately thereafter. Part 3 explores his later years, core philosophy, and contested legacy. Part 3 of 3. After transforming Carolingian education and manuscript production between 782 and 796, Alcuin now withdrew from the itinerant demands of royal court politics to consolidate his achievements as abbot of St. Martin of Tours. His final years combined rigorous administrative leadership, intensive scriptorial supervision, and spiritual mentorship of younger scholars and monks, as he planned carefully for succession and articulated the philosophical principles underlying his life's work. Alcuin's health began a gradual decline after 800, though his intellectual activity remained intense until near the end. At Tours, he oversaw a monastic community numbering approximately 200 monks and presided over the expansion of the scriptorium into the most productive manuscript factory in Western Europe. He trained a cohort of devoted students who would carry his methods forward. Rabanus Maurus, perhaps his most accomplished pupil, became abbot of Fulda and continued Alcuin's encyclopedic approach to learning and manuscript production. Frigigisus, a Frankish noble educated in the Palatine School, succeeded Alcuin as abbot of St. Martin in 804. Alcuin planned deliberately for continuity, documenting his pedagogical techniques in textbooks, establishing the scriptorium's routines as formalized procedures, and ensuring exemplar texts were preserved for future copyists to replicate. He maintained correspondence with Charlemagne until the emperor's death in 814, offering theological advice on disputes with Constantinople and political counsel regarding succession. He also engaged intensively in spiritual direction, writing letters of consolation, exhortation, and doctrinal guidance to nobles, abbots, and former students scattered across the empire. His letters, ultimately numbering over 300 in surviving copies, constitute a remarkable record of 8th century ecclesiastical and intellectual life. Alcuin died on May 19, 804, in Tours, and was buried in the abbey church. His students composed epitaphs in Latin verse celebrating him as a new...
The sink is full. Your mind is fuller. But something shifts when you start washing. Warm water, soap, purpose. Each plate you clean is a thought you release. It's not just dishes. It's freedom.
New Horace and a second Jerome. These tributes, though employing classical exaggeration, reflected genuine reverence and recognition that Alcuin had fundamentally altered the intellectual landscape of Western Europe. Alcuin's core philosophy rested on three interlocking principles that unified his educational, textual, and spiritual work. First, he believed that education was the foundation of both personal salvation and social order. In a letter to Charlemagne written around 799, he argued that systematic cultivation of learning would benefit the realm morally and administratively. He wrote, "If many followed your intentions, perhaps a new Athens might be established in Francia, or rather a much better one, for our Athens, ennobled by the teaching of Christ, would surpass all the wisdom of the academy." This vision positioned learning as fundamentally Christian, transforming classical education from ornamental luxury into spiritual necessity. Second, Alcuin insisted adamantly on the unity of sacred and secular knowledge. Grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic were not distractions from theology but essential tools for interpreting scripture accurately and refuting heresy persuasively. He demonstrated this philosophy through his biblical commentaries on Genesis, the Psalms, and the Gospel of John, which combined patristic sources with allegorical interpretation and classical rhetorical sophistication. Third, Alcuin emphasized institutional stability as the prerequisite for knowledge transmission. Individual genius was insufficient. Learning required schools, libraries, scriptoria, and standardized methods to survive across generations and geographic distances. His theory aligned closely with his practice. He built institutions deliberately designed to outlast their founder. Alcuin's legacy presents a complex picture of enduring achievements and partial failures that modern historians continue to assess carefully. What survives intact is his demonstrable impact on manuscript transmission. The texts of classical Latin authors, Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, Livy, and others, survive in surprisingly few medieval manuscripts. Most descend from copies made in the Carolingian period, particularly in Tours. Without Alcuin's scriptorium and his training of copyists, these texts would likely have vanished entirely. The Caroline minuscule script persisted as the standard writing system throughout the medieval period and influenced the printed fonts of the Renaissance. The institutional framework Alcuin established, cathedral schools linked to monastic scriptoria, remained the model for educational and textual production for centuries. What did not endure was the broader Carolingian Renaissance itself. After the empire fragmented, learning contracted sharply. The 9th and 10th centuries witnessed significant decline in literacy, educational infrastructure, and manuscript production. The momentum Alcuin created could not be sustained against political fragmentation and external invasion. Modern historians assess Alcuin's strengths as his pedagogical innovation, his ability to align learning with power, and his systematic approach to institutional reform. They recognize his limitations. He was a conservative in theology, defending established doctrine rather than generating innovation. He was not a creative philosophical thinker in the manner of Augustine or Boethius. His vision of education, though progressive for his era, remained restricted to clergy and elites. Women were largely excluded from his schools. His emphasis on classical rhetoric, though crucial for textual transmission, sometimes overshadowed purely biblical study in ways that troubled contemporaries and later monastic critics. Yet for contemporary concerns about knowledge preservation, institutional reform, and the relationship between education and cultural survival, Alcuin's example remains pertinent. He demonstrated that systematic organization of existing knowledge, combined with institutional resources and political will, could arrest intellectual decline and create conditions for cultural recovery. Methodological insight, systematic organization, and institutional standardization outperform individual brilliance as mechanisms for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Strategic insight, alignment between an intellectual reformer's mission and the interests of institutional power multiplies the reformer's capacity to implement change at scale. Alcuin's methods produced measurable outcomes. He expanded literacy, increased manuscript production, standardized script and curriculum, and preserved classical texts that would otherwise have vanished. His success depended not on personal charisma but on his ability to work within Charlemagne's political system while maintaining intellectual independence. Contemporary parallels emerge clearly. In an era of data fragmentation and platform dependence, Alcuin's insistence on institutional preservation and standardized formats resonates. His belief that education was inseparable from cultural continuity speaks to present concerns about educational equity and knowledge access. His demonstration that reform requires both intellectual vision and structural power remains instructive. Alcuin of York ultimately mattered not because he was a genius or saint, but because he recognized that learning was fragile, required deliberate institutional support, and could be rescued through systematic reform aligned with available power. That